Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on this environmental justice panel. Orlando Zero Hour has decided to organize this panel in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement because we must recognize that every day Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities are subjected and
Mm.
disproportionately affected by air and water pollution. This is another form of injustice that these communities are subjected to regularly. With this panel, we hope to expand your understanding and awareness of the unfair treatment people of color encounter with respect to land development and environmental laws. We also hope to inspire you to take community action. I'm Lorena Sosa, one of your moderators, and now I'll pass it on to Dawn. And can I please ask everyone that's not speaking to mute yourselves just in case for feedback? Thank you.
Hi, I'm Dawn. I will be your second moderator today. And we have four lovely panelists for you today. We have Bryan, Catherine, Taylor, and Kevin. And we will start with Bryan.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining us today. And I was asked if I had like a short introduction, and I actually do digital media work and was part of a workshop where I had to sort of tell my story in like 2 minutes. So I'd love to share that with you as a way of giving you some background to my personal story, and then we'll come back. So if you could play the video, Maestro, and the title is Boom. My parents grew up in the Permian Basin petro patch. My dad lived in a small town called Big Spring. When I was little, we would go back there every year for the holidays. I always thought that it was a funny name because it wasn't that big to me. It was also strange because we couldn't drink the faucet water either. Every so often, I'd forget and take a big gulp from the tap and gag from the awful taste. My mom grew up just a few miles away in a farming community of Forsan. She was a cheerleader for the high school, and their mascot was the buffalo. We used to drive through Forsan on our way to Big Spring, and I always knew when we were getting close because the air started to stink like a bad fart. Me and my brother would try to hold our breath till we drove past the stench. Sometimes I'd get headaches and start to feel nauseous, but my mom said it was because I was holding my breath. My parents eventually left West Texas to make a better life and start a family in the Petro Metro. They bought a house in East Houston just off of Telephone Road and just a few miles from Buffalo Bayou. I didn't think too much about it when I was a kid, but I grew up in a city with the largest concentration of refineries and petrochemical facilities in the world. Every morning, I wipe the dew and oily residue off the car windows with a paper towel. There was a little bayou by my house. That was my only connection to nature. But I never got to go on camping trips with the boys' club like my dad did as a kid. Today, I'm an organizer and an advocate for environmental justice for all of the young children still holding their breath. I don't have to say anything.
Thank you, Bryan, for that video. And next we will have Taylor.
Hi there. I'm Taylor Morton at We Act for Environmental Justice. I'm going to share some slides. Just a moment. So I work for We Act for Environmental Justice, which is a nonprofit located in Harlem, New York City. And we focus on environmental justice issues, environmental health issues, um, in the hopes and expectations that we can improve the quality of life of people who live uptown. And that tends to be people of color, Black and Brown communities, and folks who live in lower income communities. And we aim to facilitate meaningful involvement and fair environmental policies and practices through advocacy and community organizing. And we've been in operation for 30 years and started through civil disobedience movement with our executive director, Peggy Shepard. And since then have really been working hard on environmental health issues that run the gambit, including clean air quality. We worked on water issues as well, working on energy currently, a span of environmental health issues and urban heat island effect. And we'll talk about that a little more as we get into the panel and our conversation. To talk a little bit more about myself and how I got involved in this work. I was born and raised in South Carolina, and my family history is followed through Georgia, and a lot of that has involved sharecropping and hunting and fishing. And it's been a really key part of my family's history and culture. And it's something that I was raised doing with my brother and my mother and my father. And one thing I grew up seeing and understanding is that there weren't as many folks who looked like me who were out hunting and fishing, but it seemed to be a really key part of our history. And I ended up thinking that I was going to be focusing on conservation and biology after going to Spelman College, a historically Black women's college. Got introduced to this idea of environmental justice and found out that it was really key to understanding how people of color engage with the outdoors. And since then, I ended up moving to New York City and got involved with We Act for Environmental Justice as an intern, and was really involved with the Environmental Health and Justice Leadership Training, which is our educational training program for members and youth who have been able to be involved. So I've been lucky enough to be involved in 5 cohorts of that work, and as well as our youth work, but have been able to stay involved through our environmental health department and many of the initiatives that we have launched over the past 5 years. So I would say that throughout my journey, I didn't see my life taking sort of the environmental justice route, but it has been a key part of what I've been doing, and I would argue a key part of my history as well, and really understanding access and barriers to the outside and the right to having a healthy and safe community. Thank you.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay. Next, we will have, oh, sorry, sorry. Next, we will have Catherine.
Hi, my name is Catherine Coleman Flowers. I live in Montgomery, Alabama, and my work has been first through the Alabama Center for Rural Enterprise, and now through the Center for Rural Enterprise and Environmental Justice. I got involved in this work more than 18 years ago when poor Black people were being arrested in Lowndes County, Alabama, because they could not afford on-site septic systems. Which we have since found out don't work properly. And we've also found out that they are also connected to people having disease. And we did a parasite study, and we found that there were tropical parasites that people were exposed to in Lowndes County, one being hookworm. In addition to that, we've seen the intersectionality between racial justice, social justice, and environmental justice. And we try to take people in the community so they can see it firsthand, because oftentimes it's hard to describe what's happening in rural communities if you haven't spent time there. A lot of the things that people anticipate that they think that is common throughout the US, you'll find that a lot of these poor rural communities, they were just left behind. And our goal has been to uplift these stories, let the people tell the stories themselves, and also work on policy to change this, make sure that the policy that is being adopted on a federal level sometimes is well-intentioned, but is written in such a way that it's not inclusive of rural communities and it excludes them and they don't have access to it. And then, of course, we want to work on technologies that can not only help people here in the U.S., but around the world that are dealing with issues related to poverty and being ignored. And it creates these environmental justice issues. And more recently, I was appointed to the Biden-Sanders Unity Task Force on Climate Change, and serving there. A lot of my role was to push EJ. My own personal background, I was actually raised in Lowndes County, Alabama, which is between Selma and Montgomery. It was most of the Selma to Montgomery March route goes through Lowndes County, and Lowndes County was the home of the original Black Panther Party. It was not founded in Oakland. It was founded in Lowndes County, Alabama. And my parents were a part of that, and I continue that tradition. Black Lives Matter.
Thank you for sharing, Catherine. And lastly, we'll have Kevin.
Thank you so much. And just to get started, I won't take that much long to introduce me and my story and what I have to tell, but definitely Black Lives do matter right now. We're seeing in our country that, you know, racial justice and climate justice are intersectional, and we must bring awareness to these issues of racial justice, social justice, and the system of oppressions that are affecting BIPOC communities, marginalized voices. A little bit about me: I'm Kevin J. Patel. I'm 19 years old, and I'm from Los Angeles, California, specifically South Central Los Angeles. You know, I started my climate justice work 8 years ago when I was affected by the air and smog pollution here in Los Angeles, but also seeing all the inequalities in my community in South Central, and just really, you know, seeing how not only, you know, how I was being affected by air pollution and smog pollution, but how my community was being affected by all these other issues, such as, you know, having little to no access to resources, and being in a food prison, being in a food desert. So definitely it's been a long journey, and I think the fight is never open, you know, it's never over. And we must continue and bringing awareness to these very, very, very important issues. And again, Black lives do matter, and I'm glad to be on this panel with amazing, amazing leaders. And I'm looking forward to learning from everyone.
Thank you so much, Kevin. And we definitely want to take this time to definitely thank all our panelists for taking the time to be here and really share their stories, to stand in solidarity, or, you know, really emphasize how important this movement and the Black Lives Matter is right now. So we'll definitely start off by acknowledging what environmental injustices look like in our own communities, and kind of, we already touched on what your guys' work looks like, but really emphasize, you know, just so the audience can kind of become aware of what injustices your communities face daily.
You want to go in the same order? Yeah? Okay. Yeah, so I live in Houston, as I said earlier, and it's one of the largest concentrations of refineries, chemical plants, pipelines, storage facilities, et cetera, et cetera. But you wouldn't really know that, even if you grew up here, unless you live right next door to these facilities, or deliberately made an effort, you know, to go look at them. And for me, I think it wasn't something that I thought too much about until after going to college and coming back home. Mostly because I could immediately tell my health was impacted when I came back home for summers, and that made me, really think hard about the rest of my upbringing and life, and ailments that I had that I couldn't explain, headaches and nausea, fatigue, and then remembering where my parents were from in West Texas. They grew up in the Permian Basin. So for 2 generations, we've been around oil and gas um, economies. At one point, where the extraction is taking place, and then here in Houston, where the refining and export happens, and everything is made here: plastics, chemicals, rubber, pharmaceuticals, clothes. You name it. Everything that is made from oil and gas has to be, sort of manufactured, and there's processes. So that's kind of the part of town that I grew up in East Houston, and it was something, like I said, that didn't really impress upon me the gravity of it until after college. And in starting to look at that around the year 2000, of course, we had a number of storms begin to happen, and that broadened my understanding of the impacts. They went beyond personal health, but health of the total environment, and I'm still learning. So that's that's just a short snippet. We can go into more details, and you saw the video of my personal story too. But it's been an amazing, um, fulfilling work for me, and I've met some really powerful leaders all across the Gulf Coast and the Southwest, and globally. And really excited and happy to see more folks continuing the work.
Thanks, Bryan. Um, so in New York City, a lot of what we work through and work around as far as environmental injustices is thinking about the built environment and the way that it was built and dealing with those inequities. For example, We Act was born out of this fight to um, reduce the health risks around a wastewater treatment plant that was placed uptown, and understanding that logistically it didn't really make sense to put the plant there, that it actually was drawing waste uphill, expending more energy, and understanding the social and political strings behind that, and understanding why it was placed there, and understanding over time why most of the bus depots, and at some point all of the bus depots in New York City or in Manhattan, were placed above 96th Street, and what are the health impacts, right, of living uptown. Um, and seeing a lot of those changes, and a lot of those issues as being intentional, and as being as something that we actively have to fight behind and fight against, and understanding why those things are being placed there. I think really similar to other places and to other cities, right? There are highways that are built through whole communities. A lot of what we see, especially in the Bronx, are playgrounds and communities that have small kids, or folks who are vulnerable, who are breathing in exhaust constantly. We also deal with effects around urban heat island effect, around energy as well. And I think what we're seeing a lot around climate justice in New York City is how do we make sure that everyone has the ability to remain resilient? And that has become really important on top of all of the other environmental justice issues that we've been dealing with over a really long time. And what does it mean to, for us as an organization at We Act, what does it mean to do that work in tandem, to work on a lot of the environmental justice issues that we've been dealing with for a long time? And on top of that, now, how do we maintain resiliency, and really, really fight for our community double. I'm thinking a lot about public housing and our public housing work. And we have, one of the largest public housing, group of developments in the nation, right? How do we make sure that everyone in those communities have the ability to remain resilient? And that's a lot of what our work revolves around. And it builds every day, thinking a lot about what Bryan said. I'm too also learning every day, new information. I spend a lot of time learning and thinking about history and New York City specifically. And when you look at its background around the built environment, environment in general, and climate and race, all of those things stacked on top of each other become really complex when you move towards making policy changes or putting forward initiatives to protect folks. Yeah, that's a key part of the work that we do and the work that we fight on every day. And every little inch that we can make in a positive direction is something that we certainly celebrate.
Thank you, Taylor. Catherine?
Well, environmental injustice in my community, in the communities where I work, centers around poor people being denied access to infrastructure. And I think a lot of that was intentional. If you look at the histories of the area, in particular, I will focus on Lowndes County, although my work is around the country and I've been called to other areas, but I see some similarities in terms of what's being denied to people. Lowndes County was founded. Actually, they just removed the Confederate Memorial, something I never thought I'd see in my lifetime. But if you look at that memorial, most of the names on that memorial don't exist in Lowndes County anymore, but they existed in terms of white families, but they're the names of large Black families because they're descendants of slaves that were brought into the area. Montgomery at one point was one of the largest slave trading ports in the United States. And it became that way after they stopped the importation of slaves into this country. And the EJI does a great job of telling that story and uplifting that narrative because a lot of people don't know that. And as a result, when people were in Lowndes County at the end of the Civil War, there was a concerted effort to control the labor by making sure that people could not work outside of certain plantations. And in doing so, they enforced these what replaced the slave laws with a different type of codes that was reinforced by violence. And Lowndes County got the name Bloody Lowndes as a result. But a lot of people rose up anyway. But to keep it that way and to control people, I think a lot of times Lowndes County was denied access to infrastructure that would help it grow and help it thrive because the population was largely African American. And when I've gone to other parts of the country, like Centerville in Illinois, which is right outside of St. Louis, it's about a good 20, 30-minute drive from the airport. And I found Black communities there where people have raw sewage on the ground that look like they're in Lowndes County, Alabama, which I was just shocked to see it up north. So I'm finding that water and wastewater issues in particular exist around the country. If you go to the Colonias in Texas, you're going to see the same thing where people are denied infrastructure. If you go to the Central Valley in California, you're going to see the same thing. People are denied access to infrastructure. And when we talk about water, I think Flint raised up the whole idea of the contamination of water. But if you're having massive shutoffs like they're having in Detroit, you also have a lack of sanitation. And the reason this is so important now is because with COVID is zeroing in on people that are living in those communities without access to water and sanitation, which is a human right. In Lowndes County right now, in this state, it has the highest per capita death rate for COVID in this state. And I don't know why people are surprised, because I could have predicted that before there was COVID because of the injustices that exist there now. We just actually lost a member of our staff who was buried on Saturday because she contracted COVID. And so there are whole families that are being impacted. And those are the injustices that are existing. And it really help us to understand why we can't wait until 20 or 30 years down the road to address these issues. These disparities that exist in our communities and are exacerbated by policies that allow these kinds of things to exist in marginalized communities. We have to change that now, because these injustices are being borne out with people that are dying for an economy that does not support them.
Beautifully said, Catherine. Thank you for interweaving so many of the themes we have going on right now between both racial injustice, but also the fact that there is a link between the health of these like communities that are impacted drastically more by pollution. So seeing COVID-19 come in and affect the most was, as I agree with you, predictable. And they should be communities that are addressed more often and invited to the conversation. So thank you again. And Kevin, can you dive deeper into your work?
Yeah, definitely. And I just want to say sorry for your loss, Catherine. It's a sad thing to lose a colleague and just lose, even if it's a friend or a family. And during these unimaginable times, you can just imagine our communities, BIPOC communities and marginalized communities going through the worst effects of COVID-19. I think within my community of, South Central Los Angeles and LA in general, there's over these underlying issues, right? We have the fossil fuel infrastructure that is in marginalized communities that are affecting our communities the most. And my friend has been diagnosed with cancer, so you're seeing those effects because of the chemical toxins that are being released by these, the infrastructure of fossil fuels, right? But then you also see the freeways, like Tyler mentioned. There's freeways in marginalized communities, and when you're going to Beverly Hills or the Hollywood area, you don't see that many freeways there. And so you're just seeing the disparities that are happening within communities that are affluent and then the communities that are lower class, middle class communities. I would also in the beginning when I introduced myself, I talked about food deserts and food prisons. That's another thing that happens is that when you go to affluent communities like Beverly Hills and these upper, rich class areas, Calabasas and stuff like that, you're able to go to these restaurants and these supermarkets that have organic, non-GMO foods. When you go to South Central Los Angeles or Compton, you don't see these big supermarkets that are selling vegan, non-GMO organic foods. And so those are the type of disparities, environmental racism and environmental injustices that are happening in my community. It stems from the fossil fuel industries to the simple things as food. And food insecurity. And I also in Los Angeles, we have a huge homelessness population. So, they're the first ones that are going to be feeling the effects of the climate crisis. Right now, we're, going through a heat wave. And like Catherine mentioned, water is a right. And, what we have in LA is a lot of people don't get access to water and clean drinking water. So you have parts of Compton to other parts of LA that just don't have clean drinking water, tap water. And I'm just imagining the 58,000 people that are homeless right now in Los Angeles not getting to have clean access to water, right? It's a basic human right to think that people are able to drink water, and they're not even being able to have access to clean drinking water or let alone any access to water. So people are literally dying here in Los Angeles and being affected. So it stems from air pollution, smog pollution, fossil fuel infrastructure, to the freeways that are running through our streets, the food deserts, the food prisons, and many of the underlying health issues, as well as the infrastructure problem here in Los Angeles, where we really have a lot of gentrification in my community, and a lot of white people and white affluent communities are trying to push out communities of color. So that's another issue, right? And I'm trying to stem the environmental racism that is happening in my community. But yeah, that is pretty much the gist of what's happening and what environmental racism and what environmental injustices are happening in my community. And I could add more, but definitely I wanted to touch on those certain topics.
Oh, okay. So now that you guys have touched on many of the health concerns and issues you guys face, we wondered what it was like, the risks you guys take by being on the front line and just being active in the movement and how you involved policymakers and get other activists to join your movements as well as your organizations?
Yeah, I mean that's a good question and an important one to ask right now. Um, when when I started doing this work, and I'm sure folks before me started, most of the community just looked at us like we were nuts or crazy, and the only risk was one to our reputation. But 9/11 kind of changed everything, and it it changed the environment to the point where we were looked at as potential terrorists, um, and not because so much of the work we were doing, but because we were a real risk, right? And because of the racism embedded in what happened after 9/11. So if you were brown, of color, not white, basically, you were a potential terrorist. It was a carte blanche for authority to target you. Add that to the fact that environmental organizing was really getting stronger because of the environmental justice movement. And that meant that there were more communities of color demanding justice for clean water, for clean air, for healthy food, for everything. And at the same time, they were saying no more projects that are going to pollute our homes. So we saw, a first wave of direct action resistance, and one in particular that came through Houston was the fight against the KXL that we're still fighting. How many years later? How many times have we won and then lost and then won and then lost? Um, but during that fight for justice, we were targeted. Yeah, it's like there are records of the FBI illegally, investigating, infiltrating groups in the Houston area, breaking their own rules and protocols to do so. And what they did was, basically say that the plants and the critical infrastructure, that's a buzzword now, were potential targets for terrorist groups. So they had to be, very, very protective of them. And what that did was lead to a militarization of these zones. So, the port of Houston and all of the other ports, you all of a sudden you had all sorts of surveillance systems and cops and security guards and everything. And that made it risky, right? Um, Two, we're in marginalized communities that are already faced with over policing, police brutality, and that meant that if you got involved in any kind of advocacy, you put yourself at risk for more harassment, for being targeted by the police, and so that made it really difficult. In my area, there's a large number of undocumented communities too, so they're certainly not going to risk being separated from their families to advocate for cleaner air, um, even if they know that they're being poisoned. They can't. So those are just some of the things. And more recently, we have laws that have been written by groups like ALEC to further criminalize protest because of what happened at Standing Rock. Because of movements like Black Lives Matter. These are all connected, and basically it's a state sanctioned attempt at blocking any kind of mobility for people of color. So they've criminalized, made it federal level crimes to protest critical infrastructure. And we've already seen people charged with these crimes in South Dakota during Standing Rock and in Louisiana during the fight against the Bayou Bridge pipeline. And other states, like in Houston, I don't know if you all saw the Greenpeace activists dangling from our huge Hartman Bridge last year, but they were all charged with felonies too, for breaking that law. So, the threat is real. In other places in Latin America and Central America, the risk is your life, or your family's life. But don't think that is not possible here in the States either. So I don't say all this to scare you, but to know that it's a reality. There are risks, and aside of being a pariah in your family, for caring about the environment, and you should think about those things as you do your work, so that you can protect yourself as best you can. Yeah, check.
Yeah. On top of risk, I would like to add that cost has been really big for folks in our communities, I would say. We act as a membership-based organization, so we have members who gather monthly to go over different topics. We have like an organizing department and really spend a lot of time doing that. But based off of our history and our start, it's taken a lot of time and commitment to really do the organizing and build the relationships to change policy, and to understand that none of that work happens in a day. It doesn't happen. Sometimes it happens over many, many years, right? And a lot of times it's figuring out how to pass that baton to the next person. That's like that's a piece of like knowing and understanding what comes with the work. But understanding that for a lot of the work that we do, there's a burden of proof, that if you are having this problem, prove it, right? And our environmental health department spends a lot of time really digging into working with academic partners, working with other groups to certify that proof. But the proof definitely comes from the people, and understanding that people themselves don't have time to deal with a lot of the what we see as climate justice or environmental justice issues, and understanding that there are a lot of other things going on in people's lives, to understand and acknowledge that there is definitely a racial burden. There are definitely other barriers that are put in the way of people of color, of people of lower income communities. There are barriers that are put in our lives to prevent us from solving these issues, to prevent us from organizing and gathering. And that is a really big piece of this puzzle. And organizing not only in a moment or in a second to catch speed of something, but organizing over a long, long period of time. I think even hearing about what Catherine talked a lot about, the environmental issues in Alabama, it makes me think a lot about the environmental issues in the South in general, and how long those issues have persisted, and that has taken um, time out of seeing your family, time out of spending time with the people that you love, and time out of your weekend to invest time and organize, and spend time building those relationships to make things happen. And a lot of times things may not go in the direction that you expect it, and you spend a lot of time and energy investing in doing the work. And a lot of times our members spend time testifying around different policies, and providing that burden of proof of saying, I'm here, this is my experience, it's real, it's not fake. And that takes time out of the day, and understanding the structure of people don't have time to take a day off of work to deal with uh, testifying or doing these other things. So even if it is really important and it is a connection to a lot of the struggles that folks are feeling, just understanding that there's a very large cost across the board of doing this work, of time, investment, of building the relationships to make things happen. And that definitely should not should not be downplayed as a partner to a lot of the risks of getting involved in environmental justice and climate justice work and racial justice work over long periods of time.
Well, I would like to echo that there is certainly a commitment that you have to make, and there's also a lot that you could potentially lose, including your life, for doing this work. I was at Standing Rock, and I got a chance to see how the militarized police did not care for, you know, the citizens of our country that they should have been protecting. And I'm seeing even now, I think a lot of what came out of Standing Rock, we're seeing in the streets today in terms of organizing protests, because it was at Standing Rock where I saw people that were white actually get on the front lines and put the people of color behind them. And I'm seeing those kind of tactics being used now, and I'm a lot older than most people on this panel. So through the years, I've been able to reflect and see how things have changed, and things still remain the same. But I have noticed that through it all, the people that are always at the front of the leadership have been young people. And I'm happy to see that, and happy to continue to play a supporting role at this particular time, because I think that it should be our responsibility to nurture leadership to replace us in the event one of us is no longer here to do what we're doing. In terms of my own, the kinds of threats, personal threats that I've received since I've been doing this work, I remember back in 2002, somebody put a ball python in my apartment. I happened to be watching television with my daughter and a guest when we saw this snake just kind of dancing out of this wastebasket that was full of maps of Lowndes County. And I had to be real conscious when I called the police to come and take it out of my apartment, that they not print my address and name in the newspaper, because in small towns, they do that to show where they've gone. And I was, you know, I felt like they were intentionally doing this. Or when I got a phone call from a whistleblower who told me that someone that works for the State Department of Public Health, who has been an adversary in a lot of my work, told a group of wastewater installers that I had gotten a several $1 million grant from the government that should have gone to them. And I took it and built a house with it. I mean, it's those kinds of things that people intentionally do and use the ignorance of others to inflame them against you so that they can hopefully do something to you. So I'm always security conscious when I do this work. I don't travel by myself when I go out in rural communities, even though I'm from the community. If I do go into the community, my relatives know that I'm going to be there so that they can be with me. And I'm also armed. You know, I'm not really a big big proponent of weapons, but if you live in an environment where you have to protect yourself, you have to protect yourself. And I am prepared to protect myself. So those are real possibilities that we're all, you know, getting threats, and the threat level goes up when you start to get more attention. The more attention you get, the more threats you're going to get, the more lies they're going to tell, and more people are going to try to push somebody else up to do to you what they don't have the nerve to do themselves. So I would, just based on my experience, I would tell everyone that you have to be security conscious. You also have to, at this particular time, you know, a lot of us on social media, but I have a Facebook page that is private. So my family members, anything that I post on my family members will be on my private page. It is not on my public page, because I'm trying to protect them. And I know that for me to do the work that I'm doing, I'm putting myself out there. I don't want to be a martyr. You know, I'm from the Black Panther Party tradition, so I don't come out, I'm not going to go out without, you know, a fight. But at the same time, I think we have to also be careful to protect those family members that are not out there on the front lines, because this is a real struggle. And under this current administration, and what I just heard from my friends in Oregon, where there are federal police that are going there snatching protesters and taking them away, and nobody has any idea where they're going. We all have to be careful, and we all have to be security conscious. And I think that's why it's important for all of us to collaborate and work together.
Yeah, Thank you for that, Catherine. The process for me of taking action, what it's been like for over 8 years, it's been quite a lot, right? This is a pivotal time in history in our country right now, and what is happening with racial justice and climate justice and all the intersectionalities, definitely. But for me specifically, it's a constant fear, right? Being a person of color and being, in a marginalized community, and just taking these actions is a daily, it's a daily reminder that because of your skin color, you can, you're seen as a threat, and you can be targeted easily. And that's for many of the people of color that I speak to, many of the BIPOC communities that I speak to, and many of my peers that I speak to say the same thing, is that it's a constant, it's a constant, it's always constantly, being aware of what, the privilege that people have to even get into this work, right? And the constant threat that you can be in. There you go. I got reminded of that. But I also want to just talk about, my personal story on this is that, I receive death threats here and there, and it's very, very scary, as being a person of color and being in this fight and fighting for your community. You see a lot of people that are wanting to put you down and wanting to, send you death threats, and it's just quite scary. And it's not just death threats, it's other threats. And sometimes, these threats can get to your head, and, you might not, you want to stop the work. But I think one thing that we have to remember, there are just threats, and that I think one of the things is you have to be cautious and making sure that you assess the threat, and making sure that they don't have your address, and making sure that you're, staying private and none of your information has leaked, because definitely it is still a threat. And I guess, yeah, it's a sensitive topic for me, but, as a person of color in this country, and right now with the current administration, again, it is quite, it brings out a lot of the bigotry and a lot of the white supremacy that we have seen, not only in southern, parts of the, country, but even here in Los Angeles, where you see a lot of people coming out to be white supremacists. And so you just have to be careful. And yeah.
Thank you so much to everyone for really sharing that story and being very vulnerable with what really comes with the work of activism, especially within environmental justice. It's really important to share so that others recognize how important it is really to push through certain policies. That way, that so many activists don't have to face these repercussions of the risks that come within the activism community. So I really thank you all for sharing that. And I definitely want to cover something that's very important within the activism community. And of course, within environmental justice, we really need to highlight inclusivity. And so something that really stands out to us within Orlando Zero Hour are the Jimenez principles. And so just for some context for the audience, the Jimenez principles were principles adopted by a group of participants at a Southwest Network for Environmental and Economic Justice in a meeting in Jimenez, New Mexico. So these principles emphasize inclusivity, bottom-up organizing, letting the voices of affected communities be heard, working together in solidarity and mutuality, and building relationships, just relationships among ourselves, and of course, committing to self-transformation. And so I really would like panelists to take the time to kind of just discuss why these principles are so important within the environmental justice movement.
Yeah, thank you, Lorena. I they're paramount, right? They are paramount, and I think that the everyone's work should be guided by principles, and these are a really good starting point for whatever kind of work you do. I think, and I've had the good fortune to work alongside and learn from some of the folks who were at that gathering, and put those principles together. They're still around. We have some incredible people still with us that I think we need to continue to honor and learn from. Um, but for me, I think listening to communities who have been most impacted has been the one that I carry the most. This idea of bottom up organizing, and I do feel that when we help those at the very bottom, everyone benefits. Everyone benefits, and it's the best way, the most effective way at raising everyone's quality of life. Um, and it's no different than MLK's quote that people often say: "Injustice anywhere is an injustice, you know, everywhere to everyone. Injustice to one is an injustice to all." And that's at the core of the sentiment, I think, and just one of the things that the Hermes principles bring up. There's been a well-established understanding that there are disparities and prejudices and problems even within, the nonprofit sector, even within the left, political parties. It's systemic. So these principles are an attempt to help address some of those long-standing disparities and inequities also. And one thing that I just want to mention before I close is that what has helped me the most is also to recognize that those who suffer the most here in the States is very different from those who suffer in the global South. And I I've been participating in a media project and film that we just released recently called The Condor and the Eagle. And I've been able to meet with folks from places like the Amazon rainforest and up in Canada, in Alberta, the boreal forest of the tar sands, and met with indigenous communities that, you know, suffer incredible hardships and are met with, state violence, torture, kidnapping, death. I've been to South Africa also, to Cape Town, for a gathering that was hosted by the People's Health Movement, and saw the incredible disparities of living conditions still, post apartheid, um, there. And I know that there are so many other places in other parts of the world where conditions are even you know harder for people to overcome. So that's important, I think, for us to recognize also as organizers here in the U.S. And I think there's a responsibility for us to be advocates also for our relatives in other parts of the world. Don't forget where your homeland is. Don't forget the people who we've been separated from. Don't forget how our wealth was not just extracted from the people here, um, the indigenous first peoples this continent, and the stolen labor and bodies that were brought here, but also the millions of people who continue to suffer in similar conditions to this day in other parts of the globe. So I think, like, when we begin to think globally like that, there's a really beautiful thing that happens, that gives you peace, um, and makes the work uh, much more fulfilling and easier to do. Yeah, because you have that confidence, right, and truth behind you. Check.
Thanks for that, Bryan. Um, when I think about these principles, I think relationships is a really big thread that I'm thinking about, and um, a lot of that, I think, even with the folks in these panels, and considering that we're in a lot of different places and our issues are really different, but understanding that there are common threads throughout all of the parts of our movement and the work that we do, and not only working together through the movement, but working together inside of your community, and really understanding that intercommunal wealth and resources are really valuable to progressing the work that we do. I do a lot of work around specifically like environmental education organizing, especially around environmental justice and climate justice. And now I think we're seeing a moment where teachers are going through, aside from the normal struggle of teaching, right? What it means to teach, what it means to teach during COVID, and there are a lot of different pressures and moments to organize. But I think even in these moments, there are smaller opportunities to gather folks and focus on some of these, more specific issues. We work on a lot of different topics. We work on urban heat island and energy and health, and we have a campaign around toxic products. And aside from that, just checking in to see generally how people are. And our relationships that our staff and our organizers specifically have with our community members have been really paramount to making sure that not only that the work continues, but that everyone is okay. And that's a really big piece of it, is just making sure that we're not only looking at the goal of what we're trying to achieve, but making sure that we can get as many people to that finish line as possible. So none of that happens without relationships, and that includes everyone in our community, not only folks who are readily and actively engaged in the movement, but folks who can't make it to the protest, folks who can't make it to testify, and folks who are struggling and dealing with issues, and are on the front lines of not only on the front lines of fighting, but on the front lines of feeling the impacts of the issues and injustices that we face. So I think these principles speak a lot to holding those relationships close and really getting to the heart of maintaining your humanity throughout this fight.
I agree with Taylor. I think that we have to, the relationships are very important. Now, I looked at the principles and I saw when they adopted in the 1990s. I was a history teacher, so, I look at everything through a historical lens. And I don't see very much difference between, the principles that were adopted there and the principles of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, in terms of being community-based. And a lot of my influence, because I've been doing this work for a very long time, a lot of my influence come from those young people that were involved in the 1960s who left their homes and went in and embedded themselves in communities around the United States, and particularly in the South, to fight for voting rights. And I had the opportunity last year to actually meet with some members of SNCC, Cortland Cox and Jennifer Lawson, who were very involved. Actually, Cortland and Jennifer were ones that came up with the image of the Black Panther and drew it, and it became the symbol for a larger movement out of California. And I had to thank them because it was through their examples that I learned how to work in community, although I was from Lowndes County. But I've learned the lessons of humility that they showed at that time, coming from some of them Ivy League schools or Ivy League's HBCUs, going into the community and dealing with people who were still marking an X for their names because they were not given the opportunity to have access to an education. But yet, out of that grew a movement that people around the world look to as an example. And I think that these principles over and over again are being manifested, and their names may change. The name of it may change, but the collaboration and the principles are still the same in terms of how we engage in community if we want to be effective. But I think what is very important at this particular time is that we do collaborate and we have these relationships, because I think oftentimes we work and operate in silos. And when we work and operate in these silos, we don't realize that a lot of these same problems are impacting people in other parts of this country, people in other parts of the world, and is much larger than us. And I would like to see what one of the things to come out of this movement, because even if you look at Black Lives Matter, right now people are saying Black Lives Matter around the world. It's not just here in the United States. And I think that that's what a movement is, and we can learn from it and embrace it. And here in the U.S., I think we should work together collaboratively a lot more to solve some of these issues, because some of my brothers and sisters that are sitting on this panel may offer solutions and ways in which I can deal with some problems that I may encounter, or a better way to deal with it. Or if we're all supporting each other. And I know that when I go to meetings, it's the same people there. Everywhere you go, it's the same people that show up. But there are more and more people that are involved in environmental and climate justice, that we should all come together to collaborate to bring forth the change that needs to happen, whether it's with the current administration, which we don't hold out a lot of hope for that, or with the upcoming administration that's coming in. We still have to stay in the streets, and we're still going to have to push to make sure that justice rolled down like water.
That was fantastic. There isn't much that I can add that hasn't already been said by these amazing panelists. But one thing that I would say is that we truly want true intersectionality within our movement. We must follow these guidelines, right? And I think right now the whole movement is realizing that we don't have intersectionality, right? There's a lot more work to be done, that a lot of communities have been left out of this fight. And so it's definitely about recognizing, and really recognizing what the issues are in our movement, and seeing how can we bring in the communities that haven't been heard, because for sure there have been a lot of communities that have not been heard, and we just truly need to make sure that we're able to bring in these communities and be intersectional about the fight. And I think the first step to take is really understanding the humanist principles, because there are guidelines for the movement and to becoming intersectional. And that's what I have to add. But pretty much this, my fellow panelists added everything that, was amazing about why these humanist principles are so important. So yeah.
Thank you. I couldn't agree more. I think we do need to, especially here in Orlando, make the environmental movement more intersectional. And I think it is like the MES principles outline. Like there's so many people around the country dealing with the same issues with like different groups of people. And I think if we really came together and invited like new people to the table and made an overall like huger table, a bigger conversation, then like it's not all these like segregated places. And it's not being surprised when we find the same issue somewhere else, but instead approaching it with like a cumulative solution or like a cumulative team. So lastly, we have one audience question. This is up for anyone who can answer it. And it is, how do you suggest my team and I get college students in a rural area to engage and think about these sorts of topics? Whoever wants to take it.
Take that. Actually, I've been doing a lot of work with students from colleges around the U.S., but in particular with Duke University. The students there that have engaged with us have actually helped our organization to expand its capacity to do the work, because they've actually gone into the community. And one of the things I teach them is that, no matter where you're from, no matter how much education you have, the experts are the people that are there in the community. So you go in and listen to them, because they deal with it every day. And although they teach you at Duke that it should be this way, but it may not necessarily be that way. And they actually go and spend time, even students that come and intern at EJI from time to time will go out in the community and spend some time with us and know what it's like to be in a rural area, because a lot of people feel like You know, when they go into a rural community, they think their phones are going to work. A lot of places in the United States do not have a signal. You cannot rely on GPS going into a lot of these communities. I've had reporters, journalists who've told me, well, they've been flipped with me. I've been around the world. I don't need to write down directions. We got our GPS system. When they get lost and can't call anybody, then it's a different story. They don't even get to where we are. That has happened numerous times. Or understanding that what I call a rural lexicon, when you go into rural communities, just because a person, their address may say Hayneville, Alabama, doesn't mean they live in Hayneville, Alabama. That's where they get their mail. That's where the post office is located. Those are the kinds of things that I think we need to teach young people who are in college that want to go into these remote communities or these rural communities and work, because it's not like being in the city. There's a difference between working in a rural and small town versus working in a large area, and where people are accustomed to having access to all kinds of things, including, even if it's not in your area, but access to grocery stores and different kinds of foods that people may not see in those isolated areas. What I also try to do when I work with students is to help them go and have that gut instinct of making a commitment. I took a group of students to Cancer Alley. We were taken on a tour by General Russell Honore, and he took us to, first we went to St. John the Baptist Parish, and then we went to St. James Parish. And there, I was told before going, you can't make any commitments for Duke and blah, 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 blah. I wasn't trying to. I was making my personal commitment. But by the time we got to the church, after they saw firsthand what was going on, people were volunteering to want to come back. Those are the ways that I think we get young people engaged. And they just sent me, actually Duke has now formed, they now have an environmental justice certificate, which they didn't have before because of the work that we've been doing. In addition to that, one of my students who came and worked with me is now, he's about to get a PhD in engineering. He's a young man from Tallahassee, Florida, a young Black man from Tallahassee, Florida, who after he spent a summer with us, went back to Duke and organized an environmental justice cohort in the School of Engineering. That's unheard of. So I think that we have to give young people the opportunity to be engaged. And I think that they will step up and do what they're supposed to do. And that has been my experience.
Thank you so much for sharing, Catherine, and thank you all for joining us today. I'm going to say thank you on behalf of our organization. This is 0 Hour Ideas for Us, and of course, the people tuning in. Thank you guys for taking the time to join us today. Thank you for using your voices to continue the fight, to run these organizations, volunteer your time, testify, talk to people, start conversations. The work never ends, and I am so eternally grateful that you guys started this movement and you guys are carrying it out, and that me and Lorena and Kevin and Taylor and all of us will keep going with it and keep running with it for generations. So that is all. Thank you guys. Thank you to the people watching, and I hope you guys all learned something today. So thank you.